In this module, we will look at several business frameworks. These business frameworks will help us understand the business and set the context for the information technology or the computing components within a business. This first framework, known as Porter's Five Forces model, will help us understand how a particular organization operates within its industry structure, and how it competes within that structure. Porter's five forces, or five elements of industry structure, consist of the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of customers, the threat of new entrants or new businesses into that industry structure, and the threat of substitute products. And finally, these four elements play into the fifth element, which is the competitive rivalry within an industry. Now, keep in mind that these five forces are not independent. So the four elements certainly play into the competitive rivalry, but there's also intersection or interaction between the other four. So in the next few slides, we'll look at each of these forces in turn. Let us now look at the first of the five forces, which is buyer power. The first characteristic that impacts buyer power is the availability of choices. Therefore, what we mean by this is that if there are a few buyers and lots of suppliers, buyer power is likely to be higher because the buyer has many more choices. On the other hand, if there are many buyers and just a few suppliers, then buyer power is likely to be low. As an example of this, in the 1980s, there was only one Indian restaurant in Columbus. And so all of us poor Indians were dependent upon that one Indian restaurant if we wanted to have Indian food. So in that case, our buyer power with respect to that Indian restaurant supplier power was likely to be very low. The same situation exists if there are many substitute products. And by the way, this is an example of how the five forces interact with each other and are not independent. So when it comes to fast food, once again, for most people, a Big Mac is a substitute for a Burger King Whopper. So there are many substitutes available with respect to fast food. So with respect to the fast food industry, buyer power, in this particular case, consumer power, is likely to be high because there are all these more or less equivalent choices. The second characteristic that affects buyer power is the volume that the buyer buys from the supplier. If the volume is high, then the buyer is likely to have more power. So for example, Walmart buys a lot from its suppliers, from each of its suppliers. And therefore, the buying power of Walmart is likely to be very high because the seller is dependent upon Walmart for such a large proportion of its sales. So the third characteristic that affects buyer power is the proportion of buyer costs. So let's say a buyer is buying something from a seller. If what that buyer buys from that seller is a large proportion of that buyer's total cost. So of all the things the buyer buys from different sellers, this particular seller, the items that this buyer buys from this particular seller is of a high cost when compared to the buyer's total cost. In that case, the buyer is likely to be extremely price sensitive with respect to the product that he or she buys from this high cost seller. This doesn't directly increase buyer power, but influences it. So if there is another seller on the horizon that can sell that product at a lower cost, the buyer is highly incentivized to switch. The next characteristic that affects buyer power is buyer switching costs. So for example, let's say the buyer has incorporated some product from the seller into his or her product. So for example, a laptop maker has incorporated Intel processors in his or her laptop. The switching costs are the costs required to not use Intel chips or the Intel processor in the laptop. So it might mean redoing the motherboard, redoing the pin connections in the motherboard, perhaps redoing the power supply, things like that. So if switching costs are high, the buyers have less power. If switching costs are low, buyers have more power. The next item is the impact of the supplied product on quality. So if the supplier's product has a high impact on the quality of the buyer's product, then the buyer power is likely to be low. So for example, let's say that I'm making steel ships. If the quality of my ship is highly dependent upon the quality of steel, then my buyer power as the shipbuilder is less with respect to the supplier of the steel. The availability of information to the buyer is also likely to affect buyer power. So for example, if the buyer knows exactly what the seller's costs are, then the buyer can negotiate much more strongly with respect to the seller. Walmart is a very good example of this because Walmart's systems, IT systems, are well integrated with the supplier systems, and this was a requirement for doing business with Walmart. Walmart has all kinds of information about how much it actually costs the supplier to make something, and that allows Walmart to negotiate very hard because now Walmart has more complete information. It's the same when you go and buy a car. If you know the price that the car dealer paid the manufacturer, then you can negotiate much harder on price. Pull-through is the characteristic by which the seller is dependent upon the buyer in order to sell their product. So for example, let's say that there is a seller of laundry detergent that's sold exclusively through Walmart. Then that seller of laundry detergent is dependent upon Walmart for any and all sales of its product. In that case, buyer power is high and seller power is low. The characteristic of brand identity or the ability to influence decision makers does also impacts buyer power. So what this means is the following. Suppose I'm a seller. So suppose I make a product, I'm the buyer, and I buy something from a supplier. And people are buying the product from me because of the brand identity of the supplier versus my brand identity. So for example, consider laptops. If people are buying my laptops because I use Intel processors, then I have less power with respect to Intel. So I, as a buyer from Intel, have less power with respect to Intel. However, if I'm IBM, even though I'm using Intel processors, people are buying computers from me because I'm IBM. In this particular case, I have more power with respect to the supplier of the processor, in this case, Intel. Supplier power is the reverse or opposite of buyer power, and you will see that the same elements or similar elements impact supplier power in the opposite way to buyer power. So switching costs, if switching costs are high, then supplier power is high. If there are few substitute inputs, supplier power is high. If buyers are fragmented, many buyers and just a few suppliers, then supplier power is high. If the importance of volume sales to me as a supplier is high, then my supplier power is low. On the other hand, if I don't care so much about volume, or if there are enough buyers buying large volumes from me, then my power is high. Similarly, if my cost relative to the other elements that go into a buyer's product is low, then I have higher power because the buyer is less inclined to switch away from me. And finally, in the same way that the buyer can do backward integration, I as a supplier can do forward integration. If it's easy for me to do forward integration and threaten the buyer that way, then my power as a supplier is likely to be higher. Now note that labor is a supplied good as well. That is, the people who work for an organization are supplying labor to that organization. And the same principles for analyzing buyer power or the organization's power or supply power, which is labor's power with respect to the organization, can be used to analyze the power of labor versus the power of management. So for example, if it is hard for a company to replace me, my power is likely to be higher. If I can find, if there are plenty of jobs available in my area, then my power as a supplier of labor, as an employee that is supplying labor, is higher, and so on. Now let's look at the threat of new entrants. So the threat of new entrants is likely to be lower if there are strong economies of scale. That is, if there are incumbent companies already in that industry structure that are selling at such large volumes at much lower cost, a new entrant who comes in and initially has to sell at a small volume will be at a disadvantage. So therefore, if there are strong economies of scale within an industry, then the threat of new entrants will be lower. The other characteristic is whether there are proprietary capabilities within the companies within an industry structure. So for example, if you look at the companies within that supply a lot to the military, there are special technologies, there are special capabilities, special knowledge within their people because of the requirements that the military puts on them that they have learned over time. So a new company trying to break into that area is likely to find it difficult because it lacks those proprietary capabilities or knowledge and so on. The third element is brand identity. So if there is a strong brand identity that gives competitive advantage to the companies already within an industry. So for example, take chips. Intel and AMD have essentially dominated the processor market, and everybody recognizes their names. So a new chip manufacturer, a new processor manufacturer is unlikely to be able to break in. The fourth thing is switching costs to customers. So customers that are buying from these incumbents or existing players, if they have to pay a lot to switch away from those players to buy the products of a new entrant, then the threat of new entrants is likely to be low. The fifth characteristic is capital requirements, and this is sort of related to economies of scale. If it takes a large amount of money to set up a factory or to acquire new knowledge or to build new relationships or market a product, if the capital required for that is large, then the threat of entrance is likely to be lower. However, if the capital required to set up your business is likely to be low, then the threat of new entrants is likely to be high. Take the IT business, for example. All it takes for a new consulting organization to provide generic consulting services is a computer and a few people. That's why you see a lot of consulting organizations or people who start consulting organizations to provide these kinds of services to customers. The next characteristic is access to distribution. So if you take the grocery business, suppliers of groceries have strong relationships with the grocery stores. They have contracts that allow them to occupy certain areas in the shelves and so on. So new company trying to sell groceries to a grocery store is likely to have a hard time breaking into that market because all the other players there have established contracts with the grocery store or the marketplace essentially. The next thing is government regulation. So breaking into the airline market, for example, is difficult, not just because of the high capital requirements, but because airlines have to be certified by the government in order to fly their planes for commercial purposes. So breaking into that kind of market is likely to be difficult. The same is true for medicine. Doctors have to be certified before they can practice. Lawyers have to pass the bar exam. These are all elements, if you will, of government regulation that prevent new entrants from breaking into a market. And then finally, it's the expectation of retaliation. So if the market is such that the people already there, the incumbents, are likely to retaliate strongly if a new entrant comes in, then the threat of a new entrant is likely to be low because he's likely to be faced with a big fight if he tries to break into a market. The threat of substitutes can be characterized as follows. So if the existing products within an industry structure are considered to be high quality with respect to any substitutes, then the threat of substitutes is likely to be low. So for example, if the perception of cheese is high, then anybody trying to bring in a cheese substitute is likely to have difficulty because the consumers who buy have a strong identity or a strong relationship with the products already in the market. The other characteristic is the buyer propensity to switch. So if the buyers are fickle and are not really tied into the products that exist in a market, then the threat of substitutes is likely to be high. The third characteristic is the switching costs of customers. So if the buyers have to pay a lot to switch away from the products that already exist, then the threat of substitutes is likely to be high. So, for example, if buyers are um, very used to the taste of whole milk in their cappuccino, just to take an example, then it's very unlikely that a soy substitute or a soy milk substitute is likely to take hold. On the other hand, if buyers don't really care about the taste of milk or don't really identify the taste of milk within their drink, then the threat of a substitute like soy milk is likely to be high. And then finally, it's the ability of the firms within an industry structure to position their products collectively against substitutes. So think about where that happens. So you all must have seen the Got Milk ads. That's because the milk industry as a whole, all the organizations or businesses within the milk industry have collectively bonded together in order to position or advertise the qualities of milk. This makes the threat of substitutes like soy milk or other drinks or other healthy drinks makes the threat that these substitutes will replace milk as low. So now let's look at the fifth and final element of industry structure and competition, which is the element of rivalry. The characteristics that affect the rivalry are the organizations within that industry structure. Note here, by the way, that we're not now looking at the outside forces. Now we're looking within that industry structure, looking at the organizations within that industry structure and analyzing whether there's likely to be a lot of competition or little competition. So if there are numerous balanced competitors and they're more or less equal and there's no clear market leader, it's possible that there could be either very little competition because every one of those organizations are balanced. They know that they can't take over the rest of the market. There's no point in fighting. They all have clear customer segments that they sell to. Everybody's making money. There's likely to be less competition. If there is a diversity of competitors and their motivations are different, so let's say one company is trying to gain market share, another company is trying to simply retain its position within a market, a third company is trying to break into a market. If there are a diversity of motivations, there's likely to be strong competition. Similarly, if there is slow overall industry growth, so let's say the market is not growing and companies are dependent upon fighting for market share for growth, then there's likely to be a lot of competition. Similarly, if there are high fixed or storage costs, so let's see what that means, what we're trying to say here. So let's say that there's a company that is making money within an industry, and it wants to then grow and compete strongly with the others. In order to do that, let's say it has to buy a new factory. Okay, so it can't simply start competing with the other companies or grow in market share based on the capacity it already has. It has to acquire some large acquire some large increment of capacity in order to grow. In that case, competition is likely to be lower because any company that suddenly decides to compete will have to make a very, very large initial investment. The next characteristic is high exit barriers. So if it is difficult for an organization to leave a market, okay, hope that's making sense. If it's difficult for an organization to leave a market and go into a different market, if it is difficult, then there's likely to be fierce competition because the organization has nowhere else to go. Home ownership, personal home ownership, is a very good example of that because in many cases it's easy to buy a home, okay, because interest rates are low and so on. But it might be you might be wanting you might not be able to get out at any time you want because there are no buyers for your home, so you can't sell your home easily. Um, if you're in a situation like that, um, if a company is in a situation where it can't really leave an industry segment easily, there's likely to be fierce competition. So for example, airlines that are there in the airline industry have nowhere else to go. What are they going to do? Sell burgers? Well, they can't do that. So they will fiercely compete against anybody who tries to come in or with the other organizations within that industry structure. And then the final characteristic is the lack of product differences. So if there is no differentiation between the products that the different companies offer, that they're all essentially selling the same product. So let's say a bunch of companies selling cement or a bunch of companies selling oil, then there is likely to be strong competition. So what is the value chain? The value chain is a representation or a framework that is really part of the same five forces model, Porter's five forces model, of the internals of a particular company. The value chain is broken up into two sets of activities. One set is known as the primary activities, and the second set is known as the support activities. So the primary activities are the activities that the organization does that are directly related to the creation and selling of its product. So the first primary activity is inbound logistics, which is how does the company acquire the raw materials in order to make its product. The second primary activity is the operations. So a manufacturing company, it would be the manufacturing operations. For a consulting company, it would be the consulting services, how it delivers those consulting services. For a software company, the operations are how it makes the software. The third component of its primary activities, or rather the third primary activity, is what is known as outbound logistics, which is a really big word or really big phrase for how it delivers its products or services to its customers. So for example, the outbound logistics for a farm would be how it gets its produce or its livestock to the market. So it would include things like transportation and so on. The fourth primary activity is marketing and sales, how it sells its product. And the fifth primary activity is service. So once the product has been sold, how does it service the product? Now, these primary activities are supported by secondary activities. So for example, procurement activities, which are how does it select the raw materials to buy, how it sets up relationships with its suppliers. That's procurement, and that's a secondary activity. In other words, it's not directly related to the making and selling of its product. Similarly, technology, including information technology, is a secondary activity within a company. So for example, for a car manufacturer like Ford or Toyota, the information technology is not directly related to the manufacturing of its cars. Actually, it is, and we'll come to that later. But because there's information technology embedded within a car, so it's part of the raw materials that go into a car. But if you just think of the systems, the enterprise systems that support Toyota or Ford, they are support systems. They are not really there to manufacture the product. The human resource management, the HR organization, is a support activity. The part of the organization that hires and fires its labor does not directly go into manufacturing the product. So that's a support activity. And finally, the firm infrastructure, like the factory space, like the floor space, like the electricity that comes in, the electrical wires that come in, all those things, that's just firm infrastructure, and maintaining that, creating that, supporting that, that's all a secondary activity. So what is the value chain? The value chain is a representation or a framework that is really part of the same five forces model, Porter's five forces model, of the internals of a particular company. The value chain is broken up into two sets of activities. One set is known as the primary activities, and the second set is known as the support activities. So the primary activities are the activities that an organization does that are directly related to the creation and selling of its product. So the first primary activity is inbound logistics, which is how does the company acquire the raw materials in order to make its product. The second primary activity is the operation. So a manufacturing company, it would be the manufacturing operations. For a consulting company, it would be the consulting services, how it delivers those consulting services. For a software company, the operations are how it makes the software. The third component of its primary activities, or rather the third primary activity, is what is known as outbound logistics, which is a really big word or really big phrase for how it delivers its products or services to its customers. So for example, the outbound logistics for a farm would be how it gets its produce or its livestock to the market. So it would include things like transportation and so on. The fourth primary activity is marketing and sales, how it sells its product. And the fifth primary activity is service. So once the product has been sold, how does it service the product? Now, these primary activities are supported by secondary activities. So for example, procurement activities, which are how does it select the raw materials to buy, how it sets up relationships with its suppliers. That's procurement, and that's a secondary activity. In other words, it's not directly related to the making and selling of its product. Similarly, technology, including information technology, is a secondary activity within a company. So for example, for a car manufacturer like Ford or Toyota, the information technology is not directly related to the manufacturing of its cars. Actually, it is, and we'll come to that later. But because there's information technology embedded within a car, so it's part of the raw materials that go into a car. But if you just think of the systems, the enterprise systems that support Toyota or Ford, they are support systems. They are not really there to manufacture the product. The human resource management, the HR organization, is a support activity. The part of the organization that hires and fires its labor does not directly go into manufacturing the product. So that's a support activity. And finally, the firm infrastructure, like the factory space, like the floor space, like the electricity that comes in, the electrical wires that come in, all those things, that's just firm infrastructure, and maintaining that, creating that, supporting that, that's all a secondary activity. So now let's go back to our point about how firms compete. They compete, or they achieve competitive advantage by optimizing the value chain once they have decided upon their strategy. So in a sense, the value chain reflects the industry structure and shapes the industry structure. So when you look at the value chain of different organizations within an industry structure, you'll find that that they're often quite similar. They have to purchase the same raw materials in order to create the same products. But that internally, and by the way, so they purchase the same raw materials to create the same products, typically in the same ways. They might sell in in a similar manner, and so on. If you think about it and take a look at the fast food industry, Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Arby's, they all sort of sell the same way. They sell similar products. They source from the same suppliers, things like that. So the value chain essentially reflects the industry structure. However, internally, depending upon how a firm would want to compete, it shapes the organizational structure. So what I mean by that is, there are all these different components within the value chain, that each component doing a different thing within the value chain. The connections between these components, or whether particular components are merged or separate, will depend upon how the firm will want to compete. So that Apple competes on product design. So it should be no surprise to you that Apple's design group, Apple's product design group, the group that designs the aesthetics and the look and feel of its products, is tightly integrated with the engineering design group, the group that designs the computing part of the Apple computer, okay? Primarily because they want these two groups to sort of work together, so closely work together, they're part of the same group, because Apple differentiates itself on its product design. Basically, the point I'm making is that each activity in the value chain is a point of differentiation. And companies, in order to achieve competitive advantage, will look at each of these activities, okay, and optimize these activities. In addition, rather than just simply looking at individual activities, they look at the linkages between these activities. Because if you think about it, what is done in one activity, the output of one activity flows in or becomes the input of another activity. So when you source raw materials, those raw materials become the input to the operation or the manufacturing process. And how closely these activities are connected is determined by how a firm chooses to compete. So once again, back to design and manufacturing. For Apple, the linkage between design and manufacturing is likely to be tight. Whereas for some company that just manufactures a standard PC, the linkage between design and manufacturing is not likely to be tight. Similarly, for a fast food restaurant, the linkage between product development or new recipe development and marketing is likely to be extremely tight, because as soon as it comes up with a new product, it would want to create a tailored marketing campaign for that new product. All right, so just keep in mind that when a value chain is optimized, you're optimizing not only a particular activity, but also trying to optimize the linkages across activities. The next point I want to make is that scope affects the value chain. So the other thing you can optimize about your value chain, or rather really about your organization, is where you choose to compete. You choose to compete across the entire industry segment. You choose to compete within a particular geography within an industry segment. Do you choose to compete within a market segment within that overall industry segment? So do you want to compete over, say, teenagers or the elderly or working professionals? How you carve your market out is segment scope. Where you compete in terms of locality is geographic scope. What industry you identify yourself with is industry scope. And how integrated your value chain activities are is integration scope. Are you integrated all the way from developing the new materials, the raw materials, to selling it? So for example, if you are a grocery store, do you start with the farming of your produce all the way through to the selling of the produce? That the level of integration is also a scope that the company can determine. Okay? So just to summarize, the value chain shapes and reflects industry structure. It shapes the organizational structure. In order to optimize the value chain, you want to optimize the activities themselves and also the linkages within the activities. And the scope in which you compete both determines your value chain and is determined by how you want your value chain to be. Okay? And I want you now to think about how information technology can help optimize the value chain. Here's a note on forward-looking metrics in contrast with what are known as backward-looking metrics. So the financial metrics of a firm, how much money it has earned, how many sales it has completed, what its assets are, what its expenses were during that year, all the things that go into a company's annual report are what are known as backward-looking metrics. That means all the things that led to those measurements have already happened. So you can't really use backward-looking metrics to improve a firm's operation, or at least you can, if you get a snapshot or an annual report every year, too much time has gone by to actually affect how the firm performed during that year. What you ideally want are forward-looking metrics that tell you how the firm is going to perform, as opposed to how it has already performed. The idea behind the balanced scorecard is to bring in these forward-looking metrics. So for example, let's just take sales. Okay, If you simply measure closed sales or sales that actually took place, yeah, those are backward-looking metrics. On the other hand, if you measure new leads, those are forward-looking metrics, because if you know that the number of new leads that you're getting is rising, that means you're doing better. On the other hand, if you find that the number of new leads that you're getting is falling, you're likely to do worse in terms of future completed sales. Okay, so counting new leads that are coming in is a forward-looking metric because it impacts completed sales and it impacts future revenue. Revenue by itself is a backward-looking metric, while new leads that result in sales are a forward-looking metric. This picture is intended to indicate what a balanced scorecard does or what it's used for. So the idea is the company comes up with a vision, a strategic vision, yeah? And then you do some business planning. So I'm starting at the bottom of that picture here. You do some business planning based on the strategic vision. Yeah, you show how it connects to, you show how these plans connect to the vision. You also figure out how you want to translate that vision into operational terms. So once again, to repeat, you come up with a strategic vision or a strategy, you do some planning, yeah, you translate that into actual activities, and you have to now link the two. And that linking and communication is what links the planning to the actual activities that you're doing. And then you have the reverse step, which is you do those activities, you measure how these activities are performing in terms of meeting business goals, yeah, and you put a feedback and learning mechanism in that allows you to continuously improve. So the left side is the translation from the business planning to the actual operations, and the right side is the feedback and learning that's providing you feedback from the operational part back to the business planning. And the balanced scorecard is the element in the middle that connects all these different elements, all these different components. So now, what is the balanced scorecard as opposed to what it is used for? The balanced scorecard consists of 4 components: a learning and growth component, an internal business process component, a customer component, and the financial component. So the idea is something like this. Let's say you have to improve something, a component within your value chain, some activity within your value chain. Well, you have to train your people or give them new knowledge in order to improve that component. Then with that new knowledge, they can modify how they work within that component, or they can modify the internal business processes within that component, okay? When they modify those internal business processes, hopefully they get improvement in what they do. That makes for a better product, that makes the customer happier, and that improves or results in additional sales or more profit. Okay? Hope that makes sense. So basically, you train the folks, you give them new knowledge, you train them to do their jobs better. They end up doing their jobs better. Therefore, they end up making a better product. Therefore, they end up in selling more. And therefore, they end up in making more money. Yeah? Something like that. Hope that makes sense. And finally, this slide gives an example of a balanced scorecard. When you look at the slide, look at the columns of the tables in the slide. So the leftmost column shows the elements of the balanced scorecard and how they are linked. The next column, the objectives column, identifies for each level of the balanced scorecard what objectives need to be achieved. The next column, measures, describes how you will measure whether or not you've reached those objectives. The next column, targets, identifies what the target metric is for that objective. So if there's a cost reduction metric, which is the measure, then the target might be $100,000 reduction in cost. And the last column, initiatives, is what are the things you're going to do in order to achieve those objectives. So this example is an example of a balanced scorecard for a regional airline. What kind of regional airline? Probably American Eagle or something like that, okay? So corresponding to the 4 levels of the balanced scorecard. There's a learning objective, there's an internal business process objective, there's a customer objective, and there's a financial objective. At the learning objective, it is aligning the ground crews with what needs to be done. The internal objective is this learning that the ground crews go through will help them improve turnaround times. Because they improve turnaround times, their flights will be on time, flights will be lower cost, and therefore you will get more customers. Also, these improved turnaround times will directly lower costs. And because your flight's on time and you have more customers, you have increased revenue. And because you have both lower costs and increased revenue, you have profitability. So once again, note all these different components in this balanced scorecard. It is the objectives or goals that you want to achieve. That's the leftmost column. These goals are linked. See how the linkages take place between these goals, starting at the lowermost goal and going all the way to the uppermost goal, which is profitability. See what the objectives are for each of those goals. See what the measures are for each of those goals. See what the targets are, what you're shooting for in each of those goals. And on the rightmost column, see what you're going to do in order to achieve those goals. Once again, most importantly though, see how all these are connected together. And that's the goal, or that's the reason for using a balanced scorecard.